Yeah, well, let's dig in. Hello, everybody. I'm David Cooks, and I tell you what, we know that paralysis can take on many forms. It can be physical like mine. It can be
do anything you put your mind to.
And what we try to do is feature stories that go from difficult places to fulfilling purpose.
What seems impossible can be done by you.
We're going all the way to Africa for this episode, and I am so excited to have Catherine Namwezi with us.
It may knock you down, but don't let it stop you.
One of the perspectives that was introduced to me, I think, was just like this whole thing about racism. Growing up in Uganda, there were many things that defined me, but my skin color was not one of them. And I remember one of my reactions being, oh my gosh, I'm Black, it was almost like this realization that, oh my goodness, I'm a Black person. I did not actually know that.
Got so much to give, a lot of life to live. You must go from paralysis to purpose.
Well, I got my pen here.
Yeah.
I'm taking notes.
Paralysis to purpose.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Paralysis to Purpose, the podcast. I'm your host, David Cooks. Make sure you review, like, and share this podcast. You know, I love my job because I get to speak with some of the most inspiring and intriguing people literally in the world. And today is no exception. We're going all the way to Africa for this episode. And I am so excited to have Catherine Namwezi with us. And she was born and raised in a small village in rural Uganda. She was able to leave the village and eventually get her education, some here in the United States. She went to Hope College, where she got her undergraduate degree, and she ended up in a place called Oxford. I think that's Cambridge, where she got her master's degree in philosophy. And, she's back now working in Nairobi, Kenya, and giving back. And I can't wait to talk to her about what she's doing now and the importance of giving back. But we are so excited. I know that our listeners are in for a great treat because your story is very inspiring. And so, Catherine, I'd like to welcome you to Paralysis to Purpose, the podcast.
Thank you so much. I'm excited too.
Well, let's get started. You introduce us to who you are and your family.
Yeah, sure. So I was born and raised in a small village in Uganda. I spent most of my childhood in the same village. It's called Kagadi. And I grew up with my mother. So my father, he passed away when I was 2 years old. So I really have no memory of him whatsoever. So the person that I grew up with the most was my mom. So we grew up together in the family. And then when I was about 9-10 years old, my mom had other kids. So the twins who are my siblings, so Charles and Mary, were born. And so then we became, we got 2 more additional people. So then the 4 of us, grew up in the village and we stayed together. So I went to, when I was in about 4th, 5th grade, I went to the URDT Girls School. And it's called the Uganda Rural Development and Training Program. So it's essentially an NGO that has many different aspects, different components to it. And so one of them is actually a girls' school that they run. So it's a free school because it's supported and funded by, donors and, other partners from abroad. But the school actually provides free education to talented but disadvantaged girls. So most of us that went to the school, we came from homes that were, quite vulnerable. So most of my friends at the school were usually, they were usually, victims of domestic violence and, they were orphaned and, that kind of thing. And so without the URDT Girls School, we would usually not have had the opportunity to have an education. So what the school then would do is they would go out into the community, they would identify the girls that had potential but were vulnerable, and then they would bring us into the school. It was a boarding school, so then we spent really most of our time at the school.
Let's talk about growing up in your village. It sounds to me, at least based on the research and what you provided, that it was pretty sparse and wasn't necessarily the most wealthy place. Could you talk about some of the challenges that you and your family faced as you were growing up?
I didn't actually know that, like the village was described the way it is until I actually left the village. And then I came back and I was like, oh, wait, we are a very rural community. But so we obviously grew up with, like there was no electricity, there was no running water, there was no paved roads. When I was growing up, there were quite a few people that still had like mud huts and that kind of thing. But I think like that was really just like the way of life. And so it took me leaving the village and then coming back to realize, oh, wow, like there is definitely like a lot better out there than we, definitely had in the village. But I mean, it was, I don't know, like I think back at my childhood and I think it was, quite fun, like we would, go to the well to pick up water, like with my friends, and we always got in trouble because we would, spend like, I don't know, half an hour more playing at the well. And then the parents would not be happy because we took too long at the well and that kind of thing. We would also, because like we had no electricity, we like cooked, like on like an open fire on like the 3 stones. I don't know if you've seen, something like that. But yeah, so like on Saturdays, like my friends and I would go out to the forest to, collect firewood. And, again, we would like spend lots of time there playing and that kind of thing. And then we'd get in trouble when we came back home for spending too much time there.
That sounds
yeah,
like,
but I think
that sounds like kids are the same all over the world.
yeah, exactly. But yeah.
It's interesting that you did not really understand the poverty that you lived in until you saw something different.
Exactly.
One of the things we try to talk about 3 things on the podcast and focus that I think are pillars on the journey of paralysis, from paralysis to purpose. And the first one is perspective. And would you share a little bit about what how you begin to see things differently and how important perspective was as you began to have visions of greater things?
Yeah, no, definitely. So I mentioned earlier the URDT girls' school that I went to. And I think for me, actually, like that school was one of, to this day, actually, I think it was probably one of like the most impactful, like entities on my life. And part of that actually is because like they sort of like were very, very intentional about the kind of education that they gave to us. So they would take most of us from the village, from like different villages and, I don't know, that kind of thing. And they would bring us into the education, like at the school. And part of what they really, really intended to do was like try and like, give us like a different mindset on how we looked at things and, what we thought we could and couldn't do and that sort of thing. So it's interesting because like obviously growing up in the village, there was always this like gender dynamics, where like the boys were seemed, like they were taught or like we were told that the boys were always better at things. And like there were certain things that boys would do better than girls and, certain things that girls couldn't do and that kind of thing. And I think for me, like when I went to the URDT girls' school, like that's something that really, really struck me in how they were very, very intentional in showing us that actually there is more. You could be more, you could be different, you can dream and you can actually, like get what you actually, like dream of and that kind of thing. So I think for me, like that education was really, really impactful. And for me, even like before I even left the village, because like the girls' school is, like in Kagadi still. So before I even left the village, I guess like personally, like for me as a human being, I knew that there was definitely more, like I knew that I could be a woman and still be a doctor. I knew that I could be a woman and still be an engineer. I knew that I could be a woman and still be all these things that I had, originally been told that I actually could not have. And I think like for me, that really impacted me, but not just that. Eventually, when I was able to actually leave the village and, I got a scholarship to go to the International School of Uganda. And then I was able to like meet, like people from all over the world with different perspectives and different lived lives and, like that kind of thing. I think like part of what that did for me was it did point me back to my village to see actually what was not right, what was missing and like the gaps that still remained. But then it also did show me what could be. And I think for me, like that really is what has sort of like grounded my sort of like passion and like my commitment to even now be able to actually come back home. Because I think like after I was exposed to, like what else could be, I knew that, like there was so much more that needed to be done home. And I knew that I had to, eventually come back home and sort of like, partner with my community and, work with people and that kind of thing. So,
your siblings, you said your dad passed, you were young and did not have a memory of him.
Yeah.
And I think, did your mom pass also at some point when you were younger and you had to help raise your siblings? Is that right?
Yes. Yeah. So my mom passed when I was 15 years old. So the twins were about, like 4.5, 5 years old at that point. And so, so I automatically became the head of the family because I was the oldest, child. And, like my mom was sort of like my last parent. But then also, I guess, like the twins' dad was just never really, like in the picture. And so like the responsibility really fell on me. But I also, I became the parent to my siblings, and also sort of like, had taken the responsibility of caring for my grandmother. So our grandmother has since passed away as well. She passed away in 2017, but we were with her like 10 years after mom died. But yes, I became the parent when they were 5 years old, and we had to figure life out.
So you were being the parent, being the oldest, and that's part of tradition. If something happens, the oldest takes over, right? And you're doing that while you're getting your education and moving forward. That's a lot. So how did you manage to do that and the boarding school or the international school? How did you work that out for your brothers and sisters and you?
And sometimes I also ask myself, how did I actually manage to do that? And I say that actually because, I can give you maybe like a little bit of a backstory. So like the community where I come from, it's not uncommon to find, kids who are orphaned at a very young age. And I think it's not even just that actually, it's just that for us, like kids of my generation, we also, I guess, are like the HIV generation, like all of our parents mostly passed away in like the 90s, like the 90s, like the early 2000s and that kind of thing. So a lot of us were orphaned and left, like the older kids were left to like, become, parents at very young ages. And so for me, like, I think, speaking of perspective, I already had one perspective or like one sort of like, reality of what could and could not be, like I had seen already kids that had already been orphaned and how their lives had turned out. So when my last parent passed away, that was absolutely my biggest fear because the story never ended well. But so I do think that for me, how I managed to actually do that, it was really a combination of many, many different things. I think like one of them was, already being privileged enough to actually have, like a school, like to already have an entity that provided me with an education. And that meant that was one thing that I had to actually worry about less. Because I was receiving that education from the URTC Girls School, that meant that I did not have to, personally worry about that. Not only that, I do think like people did come along, like in some ways, in different ways and that kind of thing. So like for the twins, for example, like when our mom passed away, like after the funeral, I brought them to boarding school and their teachers and their school were really, really lenient, because I could not afford to pay. I was like, look, here are the kids. They're 5 years old. They need a space to be because I need to be back in boarding school. What do we do? And their teachers were really lenient. They were like, okay, fine, let's bring them. Let's work things out. Let's try and, make things work. And then eventually, obviously, when I joined the International School of Uganda, when I was able to actually, like get the scholarship and join the International School of Uganda, I think like many, many other people did come alongside me and they were able to actually help me and they were able to support me. That's why I met, obviously, mom and dad, like my current parents now, mom and dad, Jim and Yuka.
It is such a great joy to know that you really never have to make this journey on your own. And that there are people that have been assigned to your success. You may not know who they are or how it's going to work out. You had no idea how this was going to work.
Exactly.
But you kept moving forward and as you did, things fell in place.
Yeah.
I want to talk just briefly about the importance of education to you. And why it was so important, because you went on all the way to Oxford to get a master's in philosophy of all things. But what is it about education that's so important?
Sure. So a lot of things. One of them actually, I think like I've always known from a very young age that education was important. And I think like for me, the very first person that taught me that actually was my mother. And so my mom, for her, education was really, really important because she was the only, so first of all, she was the only daughter in a family of 10. But she was also the only one that was actually educated out of her whole family. For her.
Oh, go ahead. Because I was going to ask you, how did that work? That she was the only girl out of all these boys, and she's not supposed to do that.
Exactly.
And did you ever get a chance to talk to her about that and how
I did actually. I did, and I think like for her, Yeah, I think like for her that actually was really interesting because like so you're right, when she was growing up, girls were not necessarily encouraged actually that get an education. They were always encouraged to like get married and bring money home in form of that dowry and that kind of thing. My grandfather, my mom's dad, was actually a village chief, and so he actually had the money and the means to send all his kids to school. He offered all my uncles, he offered that she would actually send them to school, and none of them wanted an education. So he was like, okay, great. Does my daughter want to go to school? And my mom was like, absolutely. So then my mom and her dad were like, okay, great, we're going to do this. So like she went to school. And my mom always told me actually how, like when she was going to school, like her siblings and her mom, like her mother, were incredibly, incredibly unhappy. They would say, you're wasting money. She's meant to be married. Like she has to make money for us and that kind of thing. And the funny thing actually that she always told me was that, so because of that, her own mother decided that she was not going to support her in education. So my grandmother did not get up a single day to like make food for my mom to like bring to school or like walk her to school when she was working, when it was dark. And so that responsibility fell on my grandfather, who also at the time, men, like if a man was found cooking in the kitchen, everybody was like, oh my gosh, he's a spoiled boy. Like, what is he doing? Why are you cooking him and should be doing that? But my grandfather was like, my daughter wants an education, like none of my sons want an education. Her mother won't support her, so I'm going to take on the role. And I think my mom really told me that story because I think she saw firsthand like how different her life turned out to that of her siblings. And so I became the head of my family when I was 15, but I think like the same thing actually happened for my mom as well, because she was the only person who was educated in her family. And so that meant that eventually, she became the head of the family, especially after her father passed away as well. So like when I was growing up, what I would remember is like we always had cousins staying over, and like my mom was paying school fees for like all these, I don't know, cousins, and I don't even know, nieces and nephews and all of that stuff. But I think it's because like, she actually received an education. She went on to become a nurse. And so like she became the pillar of her family. So for me, growing up, actually, that was something that my mom just really, really instilled in me. I don't know what, but like she always said, whatever you do, make sure that you actually get an education. And so speaking of perseverance, actually, that was one of the things. So the week that my mother died, we were actually doing final exams at school. And I remember somebody coming and, telling me, hey, by the way, we need to go home because your mom just passed away and all of that. And I was really sad. And I went home, we went for the funeral, and then I came back to school. And when I came back to school, I wanted to mourn, I wanted to mourn my mother. I wanted to just not, I wanted to check out. I wanted to not participate. I wanted to not engage in that kind of thing. But speaking of perseverance, but also perspective, actually, I remember my teachers, because they had been teaching me, some of them had been really good friends of my mom, and they knew how important education was to her and that kind of thing. I remember all of them sort of putting up this, sort of united front and saying, Catherine, no matter what happens, you must continue with school. And I'll never forget that one of my teachers pulled me to the side right after I came back from the funeral. And she said, Catherine, the only way you can honor your mom is by doing what she always wanted you to do. And in that moment, I knew for me, my mom, education was really, really important.
And your teachers were amazing. They were like,
exactly.
Look, we understand you had a loss, and it's a real loss. Your mom's gone. And but you must continue on. And
exactly.
That's exactly what you did. Let's pause right there. And in just a minute, I'll ask Catherine about the two special people whose unconditional love helped her discover and realize her purpose. They're the reason I've entitled this episode, No Longer an Orphan. You're listening to Paralysis to Purpose, the podcast, where we feature stories that go from difficult places to fulfilling purpose. I'm David Cooks, and I'm convinced that having the right perspective is essential. As I've said before, how you see it will determine how you attack it. Well, back in season 1, I asked my guest Thomas Williams how he went from nearly giving up on his college football career to playing in the NFL. His story illustrates the power of perspective.
And I will never forget, right at the point when I was getting ready to quit football, I was going into my senior year. I talked to a coach, Ken Norton Jr., one day, and I said, Coach, I want to quit. I'm ready to be done. And I said, what's the reason of fighting a fight that you're probably not going to be able to win? And I think more than anything, which the thing that I love about Coach Norton, and I think great leaders and great employers and great coaches, whether it's business or athletics, is that they coach the person first and the employee and players second, right? The bad ones, they coach the player and the employee first. It's strictly business, but not the person. And Coach Norton knew what football meant to me and going to the NFL. And he was like, well, you can quit. And we'll never know if you were good enough or you can make it. He said, or you can give your senior year every single thing that you have, all of your mind, all of your soul, all of your might. And if the NFL doesn't accept you, then maybe they weren't good enough for you. And the day he told me that, maybe they're not good enough for you, it shifted the perspective of I'm in control. I'm the one that's interviewing the NFL. Are you worth my time? Are you worth my energy? Are you worth my body? Are you worth my brain? Are you worth my sacrifice? Are you worth all of these things? And when he told that to me, I said, all right, I'm gonna give it a go. And that's right. I'm gonna give it everything I have. For the next 365 days, I'm gonna give it everything I have. And if I don't get selected, you guys don't deserve me. Because my best is good enough for me, regardless if it's good enough for you or not.
That's Thomas Williams, former NFL player, who now motivates and encourages others facing transitions in their lives. There's a lot more to our conversation, which you can listen to in the episode entitled Dead at 16 from Season 1. Now it's time for part 2 of this week's episode with my guest, Catherine Namwezi. We talked about different people that have been in your life that have helped you on this journey. You met a couple of doctors that were in Kampala, I believe, right? Uganda.
Yes. Yeah.
And they're your mom and dad now is what you call them, and that's Dr. Campbells, I call them, Jim and Yuka Campbell. Tell us about that relationship and what that has meant to you as we begin to go from the all-girls school to the international school, and then you're about to go across to the United States to get some education. So let's talk about Jim and Yuka.
Oh, wow. I don't even know where to begin, but I think, so I remember, so I got the scholarship. So I was finishing up my O-levels, which is sort of like, 10th grade in the Ugandan education system. And I'm not going to lie, like things were really getting tough. So I actually was not sure that I was going to continue, like in school myself. I was really, really struggling with that decision because I think it was getting harder to keep myself and my siblings in school and that kind of thing. And like the girls' school was ending at some point. So then one of my teachers, again, told me about this scholarship at the International School of Uganda, where like ISU, the International School of Uganda, had decided, like the parents had come together and they had decided that they wanted to create a scholarship and offer, like an ISU education to a Ugandan, student or kid who would otherwise never afford an ISU education. So it's an international school. It's a really good school. They offer the IB, diploma and that kind of thing. So one of my teachers, I think, knew about me and my situation and all of that. And she knew that things were getting really tough for me. So she said, hey, why don't you actually try and apply for this scholarship? So I gave it my I gave it my everything. And obviously I got lucky and then I got the scholarship. And so that meant that I actually had to leave my village and travel all the way to Kampala to be able to actually to go to the school and all of that. So at the school, because my home was so far away, the school decided that, the scholarship students should be able to, or like it would be good if they would get, like a host family to sort of stay with them and that kind of thing. So then my mom and dad, so dad actually at that point was the chair of the scholarship committee, I think. So then he was like, my family will take in whichever student, gets the scholarship and all of that. And turns out that it was me. So then I joined the Campbells and lived with them. I think for me, like that relationship really, it means a lot of things for me, like many, 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 many different things. For starters, I think for me, it was so good to be a child again. It was so good to be able to breathe and say, I do not have to be the parent again. And I think I just had really held, I had taken on this responsibility, from my mom, and I was caring for my siblings. I was caring for my mom, for my grandmother. And that meant that I had become the sole provider, of medical care and education and food and clothing and all of that stuff. And I think for me, even the lesser things, I think are the ones that really got to me, like being able to think about what are we having for dinner. Like I did not want to make that decision, but like I had 5-6-year-olds that wanted to eat, and they were like, what am I having for breakfast? What am I having for lunch and dinner? And I was like, can you please just leave me alone? But I think like for me, I have to say, like, I think for me, the thing that really struck me the most is like when I moved in with the Campbells, for me, like it was just like having that sense of relief, knowing that I do not have to be the adult anymore, like in the house, I can actually be a child again. And so I actually automatically called them mom and dad, because I think like for me, that was just like, it was, I don't know, like it was something that I really, really needed at that point. But not only that, actually, like they've really been like incredibly supportive. They really just like took me in and just like completely loved me, like unconditionally. I mean, we speak of like, you speak of like Christianity, and you sort of like, talk about like the love that, the Bible describes and that kind of thing. And I think for me, like if there is anything that I've actually sort of like, realized, it's this, absolute, unconditional love, knowing that there was actually nothing that I did to earn that love, but it was just there. Like it was given to me, fully and wholly, and I didn't not have to earn it, but I also could not, like I could not unearn it. Right. And I remember like one of the moments actually, like when I first joined ISU, I got on like my first, like when I first joined, like the first few months, I did well in school, and I think I got on like the honor roll or something like that. And I remember Dad coming into my bedroom, and I'll never forget what he told me. He said, Catherine, look, I know you don't have parents of your own, but I want you to know that Mom and I are very, very proud of you. And so for me, like that, like I knew I was home, right? Because I knew education was really important to my mom, like I knew, and so I knew that's the kind of thing that my mother would have said to me, like she valued, my, academic success and that kind of thing. So when Dad told me that, like for me, like that just, it broke down lots and lots of barriers for me. Like I knew I was actually home. And they just really just loved me. And I got a new set of family. I got a new set, like siblings, like I got old brothers because there is 4 boys. So I got old brothers, but like I just really became part of the family. And like I was really supported a lot, like when I was, like in the US, I think for me that made a very big difference, like going from, like the village, to ISU, and then like, on to America. But I think that was really easy again, because I already had my family, like in the US. And when I was going to college, Dad and like one of the boys, I think he was Matthew, they actually drove out all the way to Michigan with me, and, they helped me move into college and that kind of thing. And when I was in Oxford, like Mom would come, like she came every year, bringing me Christmas presents, and, would, still see each other and that kind of thing. So I think like for me, I think like what that relationship really, I guess like symbolizes, or like what it's really taught me, it's just like, it's love, like I cannot describe it any other way. It's just like this unconditional love. Like I find so much safety in that. And it's interesting because like that for me was one of the things that I feared the most, like after my mom died. I think it was just like, sometimes like you're not sure, like if you're loved, and you feel like you have to earn the love, and you feel like, if I'm not good, if I'm not kind, if I'm not this, like I will not be loved back, and that kind of thing. And I think like for Mom and Dad, like it was very clear to me that I will never unearn it, like I will never not be loved, and like I will always be loved. And I think for me, like that, like there was so much safety in that I breathed, like I was able to breathe, and I was able to actually be a child again. And that for me, I think meant, like it meant everything to me.
And that's a fantastic story, because they were in Uganda doing some research. I think, was it AIDS research, I think?
I think Mom works with the Infectious Disease Institute. I think she worked a lot with, the HIV patients, and then Dad worked with the CDC.
So they were there on a mission, on assignment. And, just happened, to come across your path. How did you meeting Jim and Yuka, the Campbells, impact your siblings and your relationship with your siblings? How did that impact that?
I mean, I think for starters, I think I feel like I was able to actually love and care more once I actually, sort of like had my own cup filled. Like I think he was maybe getting like he was drained a little too much. And I think like for me, being able to be supported, I think meant that I could actually support my siblings, even more. But even like in more practical ways, so like when I was able to like babysit like one of my siblings, I mean, so that was one of the things that I learned when I joined the international school, that when Mom and Dad went out, they left the little kids home, Jack and JT, and they asked me and Tom to babysit, they paid that. And I was like, okay, I can do this. But I think so. I think it was even just like little things like that, right? Like being able to then, even like have a little bit more to like financially support my siblings, and that sort of thing. But then also, yeah, I mean, just like different things. I think like for me, again, like the biggest thing, and again, like I keep on coming back to this thing of like love and feeling other people and that kind of thing, because I think for me that really is the most important thing that I was given, and like the most important thing that I also have to give to other people. So I think like most fundamentally for me was like once my cup was filled, then I felt like it was actually a lot easier for me to then like give to my siblings and to love them and to support them and that kind of thing.
So you went to Holland, Michigan, and
Yes.
I live in Wisconsin, and I've taken the ferry over, and I love Holland and the tulips and the whole downtown area, beautiful campus. What was your college experience like, being an international student here in the United States?
It was overall, it was a fantastic experience. And I think, again, it's like a combination of many things that actually made it, like a wonderful experience for me. I think I was able to grow in many, many ways. I was able to expand my perspectives, like being able to just like be in class with people from, different communities that have, had different lifestyles growing up and that kind of thing. But I think, I guess, like maybe part of that is because of, so coming in, I think my experience at the international school and being able to like have mom and dad and like tap into their own community and that kind of thing, it did prepare me really, really well for Hope. So I always say actually like the most cultural shock I've ever gotten was in Kampala at the international school and not necessarily actually at Hope. And I think that's because like I came straight from the village to the international school. And that for me, like that change was really, really big. But I think the school and the community really prepared me well to be able to actually thrive at Hope. So I think in that sense, I honestly felt like a celebrity on campus because, again, like there was very few of us, from the African continent, but just like even just like the student, the international student body in general. So, and I love to talk, as you might have figured out, by now. So like, I was always asked to like, speak about things and to like give my perspective, and I would share in class and that kind of thing. So like that aspect of it, I think I really loved. And I think also like Hope being a very, being a Christian school, I think like my first impression actually when I went to the school, one of my teachers, Miss Sonia, actually asked me, like what was your impression of Hope? And I remember thinking like for me, like my first sort of like, observation was that the people at Hope were more Christian than the school itself. They really pour themselves out and like they really support you. And I remember like I had a job on campus and I worked with a lady called Miss RJ, Regine Walters, and she just loved me as like her own child and she supported me and like my professors, my, like academic supervisor and all of that, like they were really, really, like incredibly supportive people. So like in that sense, I think like I fit in quite well. But on the other hand as well, I have to say, I think for me, like going to the US in general, and maybe just like even Hope, I think like one of the perspectives that was introduced to me, I think was just like this whole thing about racism. And I think for me, like that was the first time that I sort of like had to actually grapple and sort of like understand what that actually meant. And it was interesting because I don't know, like there were many different explanations, but like for me, I never, like growing up in Uganda, like there were many, many things that defined me, but my skin color was not one of them. And I remember like one of my reactions being, like when I had, like racism and all of that, I was like, oh my gosh, like I'm Black, like it was almost like this realization that, oh my goodness, I'm a Black person. I did not actually know that. And I think it's because, like when I'm growing up, for me, there were other identity markers. So like my sex, for example, like being a woman and educated, and, those were things that for me defined me. So like, I think one of the student groups that I was part of, they made us do this exercise where they would say, describe yourself, like, introduce yourself. And it was interesting because like all of my African-American friends, they would say, I'm an African-American, blah, blah, blah. Whereas for me, it was, I'm an educated Ugandan woman, like those were the sort of like the things that I used to describe myself, but not necessarily race. And I think for me, like, again, like my parents played a very big part in that because I remember not being able to understand, like I was not able to actually understand the struggles, but also like the depth and just like the, just like how much ingrained, like racism is and different things and all of that. And I remember like there were a few times when I felt like my African-American friends and myself had we had very different experiences at Hope, like for me, I loved it, like I felt like a celebrity. I was asked to talk and share my perspectives and that kind of thing. And, for me, like when somebody, asked something like, hey, can I touch your hair? Hey, can I do this? Like for me, my interpretation was never that, this is rude, this is racism or anything like that. For me, it was just like, yeah, sure, absolutely, and I think maybe it's because I did not actually have that lens. But my African-American friends, like the experience actually was quite different in that sense. And I remember, I think it must have been like the first Christmas when I was at home, or maybe like the second one. I remember going home and like I was having this conversation with dad in the car, and I was like, I have friends who I feel like they're probably not happy. And so like a lot of my friends, did not have, or I felt like our experiences were actually different. And I remember Dad actually gave me a book, like To Kill a Mockingbird, to read that book. And then he gave me another, and I read like another one of like Maya Angelou, I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings, and all of that. And I think for me, like at that point, it started to sink in. Like I started to actually see, and I started to actually understand, and I started to actually like relate and sort of like, understand other people's stories and, perspectives and experiences and that kind of thing. So I think for me, like that's, that is something that I do not take lightly, because I do think like I did have quite a bit of ignorance, I think as well, coming in. And that's because, like, again, that's something that I hadn't really grown up with. It's something that I hadn't sort of like had to grapple with and all of that. So I think like coming out of America, for me, I think like that was something that really had a very big and profound, like impact on me. I think like without my American education and like without my experience at home, like on campus and like the hard conversations that I had with friends, but also like with my parents and all of that, like I feel like I would never have understood or even like started to understand, like as much as I actually, sort of like do right now.
And that is some great insight because there's often this divide between Americans of African descent and African Americans, and their experiences are vastly different. But what you did is what everybody kind of needs to do, is to try to see it through the lens of someone else. And by doing so, you begin you may not understand it all or have experienced it all, but you develop some sympathy and empathy, and you're like, okay, now I get it, but that's growth. I mean, that's growth. And if you're not willing to be open and grow, then, I mean, you could have had your experience, done great, graduated, went to Oxford without having a better understanding of some of the people that looked like you, that didn't have the exact same experience. It doesn't make you any better or less better than them or anything like that. And I think sometimes that's the struggle that we face, is that it doesn't make me any better or any worse because my experience hasn't been exactly the same as yours. Hopefully we can still work together and move forward. That's just a great story.
We'll get back to David's conversation with Catherine Namwezi in part 3 of the podcast in just a minute. David narrates his own story in the audiobook Getting Undressed: From Paralysis to Purpose, which is now available to purchase and download. Here's a brief sample in which he recalls how several key friendships helped him navigate the challenges of getting his high school education.
There were 4 classmates in particular who made my transition from a life of walking to life in a wheelchair as pleasant and productive as possible. Robert Tomlinson, also known as RT, William Bill Thompson, Jan Mueller, and Jim Van Eerden. They made sure I went to school dances, sporting events, and they welcomed me into their homes and included me on their social calendars. We were an eclectic circle of friends with diverse backgrounds, personalities, political leanings, religious outlooks, and economic statuses. Still, each person found his own way of confirming to me that my life wasn't over, even if I'd have to spend the rest of my high school career in a wheelchair. 4 friends, 4 different walks of life, yet each person fulfilled a different purpose for me, and all 4 demonstrated an unconditional commitment to helping me navigate my obstacles. The obstacles along the way didn't redefine me, but they did redirect me. So often in our minds, we make obstacles permanent in their existence, which causes us to stop. As I was redirected to Bob, Jan, Jim, and Bill, we helped each other move forward in life. In May of 1982, I accomplished my goal of graduating from high school the same year as my class. The irony of completing this goal was its location, Humphrey Gymnasium, the place I dreamed about playing basketball for Marquette High School. Humphrey Gymnasium no longer served as a reminder for what I didn't get to accomplish on the court. It served as the place where I could get a standing ovation, not for making a basket or getting a steal, but for beating the odds, overcoming obstacles, and finishing the course.
That was David Cooks narrating an excerpt from Chapter 4 of his book, Getting Undressed from Paralysis to Purpose. Treat yourself to the audiobook. You'll be inspired as you learn proven principles for navigating your own challenges en route to discovering your purpose. Now, let's get back to the podcast.
You leave Holland, Michigan. I tell you what, they have some of the best apple cider donuts, and
They do. Absolutely.
Yeah, I used to. I'm not going to talk about that, but they are really good. So you end up at Oxford.
Mm-hmm.
What a great! So you've had all this high level education and different exposure. So I'm sure you fit right in at Oxford. Why philosophy?
Yeah, so it's actually a master's of philosophy in international development. So like that was definitely that aspect that was added on for like international development. So I think for me, that was maybe the draw, international development. And I think like part of that is because of, like what I already said before. I think for me, like living home and being exposed to like different perspectives and that kind of thing, it really built in me this desire to want to actually come back home and, I don't like to say work with, but I wanted to like come back and partner, like I wanted to come back and partner, like with the people in my community to sort of like, bring on, like different change and that kind of thing. And I think like, it's not even just that, I think it's even just like my story and just like the observation of like how things turned out for us, like for me, I always ask myself questions like, what went wrong? Like why did anyone anywhere trust a 15-year-old with 2 5-year-olds? That obviously like there is something very, very wrong with the system. Like there is, I was a child myself and I should never have been trusted to be, like the sole caretaker of 15-year-olds and that kind of thing. So one of them is that my sister actually was affected very, very much out of the three of us. And I think that she struggled a lot with, like trauma and that kind of thing. And like there was a period in her life where she really, really struggled a lot. And, she was very violent and she would cry all the time and she wanted her mom. And, there was nobody to really explain that to her. And like, they would beat her up instead and that kind of thing. And what I think like eventually what I realized is what my sister needed was a listening ear. What she needed was somebody to actually listen to her. I was a child and I didn't know how to actually deal with that. But also like there was no support within the community to actually like meet her and say, let me, provide the support that you actually need and that kind of thing. My brother also actually at some point I noticed that he struggled a lot, because their dad, like left them as well, like they still have their dad and, he's still alive, but he also walked away. And I think like there was a time when I think like my brother really, really struggled with that, like he really struggled with, I think, like just like his father leaving him and that kind of thing. And, I could tell like every time he mentioned his dad or like the dad, he would just not want to even like engage and like he would storm out of the house and that kind of thing. But I think like there was a lot that was maybe not working well, but there was also like the system was just not equipped to actually provide the support that we actually needed. But not even just that. I mean, like there is still so many, people that aren't able to get an education. There is still so many people in my community that do not have clean drinking water. They do not have electricity, like they do not have, any and all of these things. Like their reality and that of their kids, will probably be the same and like it will never change and that kind of thing. But yet for me, like looking at how much, like I have grown, like you talked of growth, but like how much I have grown by like getting an education and being exposed to like different cultures and that kind of thing. Like I want, I want to give that to everybody.
That's fantastic. So giving back is obviously very important to you and kudos for doing that, because a lot of times there's sacrifice that goes along with that. And and if you understand that and if you're purpose driven, you know that the sacrifice means something and that eventually, it pays off in whatever way that does. What is next for you? What's your next goal and dream?
I think in terms of like what's next, I mean, I do know for sure that I do want to stay within East Africa. I think I think the need is quite big, and I think like there is like a lot that needs to be done here. So I think like, I mean, I cannot tell you exactly what I do want to do, but I know that I do want to continue, partnering with communities. I do want to continue to sort of like see like people's lives change. I've always like my passion is actually in education still. And I'm not convinced that the education system, mostly, like back home, is actually designed in such a way that it actually helps to transform the individual. To me, it seems like, the education system is really like, it's really about like memorizing stuff, getting the exams done and like you're out of there. But it's not really about like learning and growing and like, transforming the individual in that sense, like giving you that different perspective and, giving you those different, I don't know, like passions and visions and that kind of thing. So I think for me, like ideally, that's where I would like to see myself going to, like where I sort of like, work with communities, partner with people to ask the big question of like, how can education actually become educative? How can education actually become transformative? And I think for me, like I'm convinced that, with the transformative education, then a lot of the things that we face today, in society with like, poverty and corruption and lack of innovation and, all of these things, like I do believe that we would actually be able to like, work towards solving and, sort of like, transforming some of these issues and that kind of thing.
I tell you what, I think you hit it right on the head. Here in America, I think our public school system is in need of being reinvented so that we can have transformative education and change people's mindsets and let them see opportunity in the things that they would know instead of just going to school to get a job, because that's
exactly
what do. They go to school to get a job, and we're missing it. And I think your insight is very, very, very good. So stay with that. Last thing I want to talk to you about, because you've been great today.
Thank you.
I know that faith is an important part of your journey. And on Paralysis to Purpose, I'm not afraid to talk about faith with people. And I've had Buddhists on here. I've had atheists on here. I've had Christians on here. And I want you to talk a little bit about the role that faith has had in your life.
Yeah. So that's been a very big part actually of my life, I have to say. I think like that for me, before even like the education, before meeting my parents, before having all these connections and partnerships and that kind of thing, I think like for me, faith was the very, very first source of hope for me. And like the very, very first thing that like made me hold on, sort of like made me hold on. And it's just been, it's really, I can't really like even begin to like talk about it all, but I think for me, just like reading the Bible, but even just like getting like the central message of, just like hope and, holding on and, like being able to like, look forward to like a better future and that kind of thing. I think for me, like that was something that I really, really held on. But then also I think like, there were a lot of things in my life that happened that I think, could be explained that way by some people, or they could actually be called coincidence and that kind of thing. But I think for me, I like to actually associate those things to, faith. So for me, even little things like being able to actually meet my family and, be able to actually have, somebody that I can actually call, like a mom and a dad. That for me was something that I really, really longed for. That for me was something that I really, really wanted. And I felt hard, like when that actually happened. There was a lot of moments, I think, that I really wanted to give up. And I think I would have been justified. It would have been right for me to give up. But I held on, because I knew that I actually was not alone. There were moments when I was absolutely alone. I felt alone and I felt confused and I wasn't sure I would do it. I wasn't sure that I would actually make it through to the next day or like, to whatever, to the end of whatever was going on and that kind of thing. But I held on again, I think. And I think I held on because of just like this, I held on because of like the hope that, like the gospel and just like the, like this, just like the, the Bible in general gives and that kind of thing. And not just that, I think for me, it goes back to, so the book of 1 John for me is probably one of like the most impactful, like books for me in the Bible. It's also one of like the smallest ones, like it's very, very small. But I think for me, like I really, really like that. And I like one sentence in that book in particular, and it says, "No one has seen God, but God is love." And I think for me, maybe it's my personality, maybe it's who I am, but I think for me, like love, being able to love and support people, being able to like provide and give that unconditional love, for me, like that has been one of the most, like I think for me, like that's one of like the most important things, like important things in life, and not even just that, I think like being able to, and this is, I think like the role that really faith has played. I think like I've always known that I'm loved. by people, by friends, by my siblings and that kind of thing. But I think like it took me a very, 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 very long time to actually accept that love. And I think like faith and like being able to like read the Bible and like being able to just like see the example of Jesus and like how he loved so deeply, so unconditionally, so fully every single time. And like when he interacted with people who were, supposedly like the outcasts and like the sinners and that kind of thing, like his reaction, I feel like for me every single time was meeting them with love, every single time was saying, I see you, I know you, and I still love you.
Before we end, if there are people who will listen to this podcast literally around the world, if you had one message, one opportunity to tell the listeners something, what would that one thing be?
But I think for me, it would be to say that if and when you have the opportunity to love, you should love. But also in the same way that if and when you have the opportunity to be given love, you should actually accept love.
Well, thank you for that and for the opportunity to interview you today on Paralysis to Purpose, the podcast. This has been worth the technical issues we had and getting it all done and cameras not working and freezing up the screen. But this is great. I know that you don't have a website and you're not on social media, but I think that there's an opportunity and a platform for you to share your story. And you should consider that because I know there are probably little girls throughout Africa who need to hear your message and hear your story. So if there's anything that we can do from Paralysis to Purpose to help you with that, let us know. So thank you again for your time, Catherine. And until the next episode of Paralysis to Purpose, the podcast, I'm David Cooks reminding you that your ability to endure is always greater than your willingness to endure.
You can do anything you put your mind to.
Thanks for tuning in to Paralysis to Purpose. Don't forget to follow us on social media at Paralysis to Purpose on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. To purchase his book, visit davidcookspeaks.com. Be sure to tune in next time for more inspiring conversations with David Cooks.
And it was the hardest decision I ever made in my life. I had the potential of becoming a multi-world champion. I beat many multi-world champions and I gave it up.
Next time on Paralysis to Purpose.
I am so excited to have Hector Colon with us today.
But that same dedication, determination, and discipline it took me to be a champion boxer is the same dedication, determination, and discipline that I apply into my life, striving for excellence in everything that I do, whether it be as a husband, as a father, or as a CEO. I got that drive from boxing.
Paralysis to purpose.